Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into something I find absolutely fascinating, the architecture of resilience, specifically looking at Disney's early failures. When we think of the Disney empire today, it's so easy to just picture instant magic, massive global theme parks, and this unparalleled string of successes. But the reality? That colossal empire was actually built on a foundation of absolute, catastrophic failures. Seriously, we're going to explore how surviving a whole series of devastating corporate and creative disasters is exactly what laid the blueprint for Disney's ultimate success. So picture this for a second. You're sitting across from your boss early on in your career, and they look you dead in the eye and tell you that you are entirely devoid of good ideas. Imagine getting fired because someone in authority decided you just didn't have any imagination. Sounds like a total career-ending nightmare, right? Well, that brings us to a massive historical plot twist. Okay, let's really dive into this. At just 22 years old, that exact gut-wrenching scenario actually happened to none other than Walt Disney himself. He was fired from a Missouri newspaper, the Kansas City Star to be exact, with his editor explicitly stating that he, quote, lacked imagination and had no good ideas. I mean, wow. This completely shatters the whole myth that Walt was recognized as this instant, untouchable genius from day one. Instead, it introduces us to the core theme of our explainer today, this recurring cycle of severe problems, brilliant pivots, and massive payoffs. He actually had a pretty wild way of looking back on all this later in life. Walt summed up his journey with this powerful thought. You may not realize it when it happens, but a kick in the teeth may be the best thing in the world for you. So for the rest of this explainer, we aren't just going to rehash Disney's triumphs. We're going to look at his career as a series of high-stakes, kick-in-the-teeth survival stories. Because honestly, without these devastating blows, the company as we know it literally wouldn't exist. Let's rewind to his first major venture. It's 1921, and Walt starts Newman's Laugh-O-Grams in Kansas City. He's innovating, making these local animated slides and topical humor pieces. But by 1923, he's hit with a severe, crippling cash flow deficit. Why? Well, he got locked into a predatory distribution contract with a company called Pictorial Clubs, and they actually went bankrupt before they fully paid him. This dragged Walt down into his own total bankruptcy. He lost his staff, got evicted from his building, and literally had to sell his movie camera just to scrounge up enough cash for a one-way train ticket to Los Angeles. He arrived with practically nothing. Now this is where things get really interesting, because that massive failure forced a crucial pivot. Walt realized pretty quickly he couldn't do the whole business thing alone. He desperately needed a manager. Enter his older brother, Roy O. Disney. See, Walt was the visionary. He was all about boundless creative leaps and pushing massive budgets to the absolute limit. Roy, on the other hand, was the logical one. He provided that grounded financial management, dealt with the banks, and somehow kept the company solvent. The whole Laugh-O-Grams disaster proved that Walt's unchecked creative risks needed Roy's financial realism to survive. They became equal partners, and that dynamic right there became the true engine of the Disney Brothers cartoon studio. So with Roy keeping the books balanced, things actually start looking up. By 1927, Universal Pictures, working through a distributor named Charles Mintz, requests a new animated series starring a rabbit. Walt and his chief animator, Ub Iwerks, get to work and create Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And Oswald was a massive hit. They were pioneering personality animation, securing early merchandise tie-ins like chocolate bars. It was huge. The studio was churning out a short every 2 weeks, and they were finally tasting some real, tangible success. But then, bam, the second major kick in the teeth. In early 1928, Walt travels to New York fully expecting to negotiate a well-deserved raise from Mintz. Instead, he walks right into an ambush. Mintz basically counters by offering him $500 less per short and casually reveals that he secretly poached almost all of Walt's animators. And the absolute kicker? As Walt scrambles to review the contract, the devastating truth hits him. He doesn't even own Oswald. Universal owns the copyright. Walt refuses Mintz's terrible terms, and on this incredibly long, depressing train ride back to California in the summer of 28, having lost his primary character and his entire staff, he starts sketching a new character. A mouse. Now, what's really interesting here is how that brutal loss directly forced the ultimate legacy-defining pivot. With Oswald, Universal and Mintz held all the cards, the copyright, everything. Disney was just a work-for-hire producer. But losing Oswald forced a complete 180. With Mickey Mouse, Walt Disney Productions would fully retain all legal copyrights. They shifted from being external hires to having total sovereign studio ownership. Never again would they be at the mercy of an external producer owning their own creations. This right here was the turning point. Walt basically swore he would never, ever relinquish control again. Before he even got back from New York, he wired Roy to lock down his best, most loyal animator, Ub Iwerks, to an exclusive contract. And together, in absolute secrecy, they developed Mickey Mouse. This permanently established a corporate policy of absolute copyright ownership, which, by the way, is exactly why the Disney Vault is so incredibly powerful today. Think about it. If Mintz hadn't stolen Oswald, Walt might have never created Mickey. And he certainly wouldn't have learned to aggressively protect his intellectual property. Okay, so they have Mickey. They have their independence. Fast forward to the 1930s, and Walt is ready to take another massive leap. But let me ask you, would you put absolutely everything you own on the line, literally mortgage your family home, just to make a single cartoon? Well, that's exactly what Walt and Roy did to fund the world's first hand-drawn, full-length animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The production budget for this thing ballooned to a terrifying $1.5 million. To put that into perspective, that's roughly $33 million in today's money. And keep in mind, no one had ever made a feature-length cartoon before. The press and the critics were openly mocking it, calling the project Disney's Folly, and basically taking bets on it bankrupting the studio all over again. And this brilliantly illustrates why Roy being there was absolutely critical. To finance that unprecedented $1.5 million budget, they had to borrow heavily. Bank of America loans essentially collateralized the entire studio, and both Walt and Roy took out mortgages on their personal homes just to get the cash to cross the finish line. If Snow White flopped, the bank was going to liquidate everything. It was entirely Roy's grounded business structures and his relationships with the banks that kept Walt's massive creative gamble afloat during years of incredibly expensive production. But you know, as Walt himself put it, the difference in winning and losing is most often not quitting. And they didn't quit. Snow White released to staggering, unbelievable success. It became one of the highest-grossing movies of all time, completely shutting up the critics. The massive proceeds from that single, terrifying gamble paid off all those loans and were actually used to purchase the permanent Burbank studio lot that the company still operates out of today. All right, let's fast forward to 1955 for the real climax of this story. Walt decides he's going to bet the entire studio once again, but this time on a literal theme park, a completely new paradigm of family entertainment called Disneyland. Opening day, July 17, 1955, was supposed to be this smooth, invite-only event broadcast live on ABC. Instead, it devolved into an operational nightmare so severe that the Disney employees who were there still refer to it as Black Sunday. I mean, it was just pure, unadulterated chaos. They expected about 15,000 guests, right? Over 28,000 flooded the gates because of widespread counterfeit tickets. This caused a massive 7-mile traffic jam on the Santa Ana freeway. Then, a plumber's strike during construction meant Walt literally had to choose between finishing the bathrooms or the drinking fountains. On top of that, it was a scorching 100 degrees out there, and the freshly poured asphalt on Main Street was melting so badly that women's heels were getting stuck in the tar. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, the Mark Twain riverboat got so dangerously overcrowded that it derailed and literally sank into the mud. But here's the thing. This is exactly where decades of hard-won, institutional resilience kicked in. The problem was catastrophic infrastructure failure. The pivot? Rapid, uncompromising operational updates. Regarding the plumber's strike, Walt famously told the contractors, "People can drink Coke and Pepsi, but they can't pee in the streets. Finish the restrooms." He ruthlessly prioritized necessities to survive the launch. They dragged the riverboat out of the mud, fixed the rise, and continuously adopted. By learning from the utter disaster of Black Sunday, they refined their operations so incredibly fast that they welcomed 1 million guests in less than 7 weeks. Which brings this whole explainer beautifully full circle. Like the quote says, "A kick in the teeth may be the best thing in the world for you." The global Disney entertainment empire we know today wasn't built on uninterrupted success, not even close. It was built on systematic resilience. It exists because the Laugh-O-Gram bankruptcy forced Walt to lean on Roy's financial genius. It exists because the devastating theft of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit forced the creation of Mickey Mouse and a strict policy of IP ownership. It was built on surviving the financial terror of Snow White and the absolute operational chaos of Disneyland. So as we wrap things up today, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. If the architecture of one of the most beloved, resilient companies in history was drafted using the lessons from devastating bankruptcies, betrayals, and massive public disasters, what could your greatest failure help you build? Thanks so much for exploring this with me, and keep learning.